Welcome back, everyone, to the third and final part of our look at the Apollo program on Epic History TV. Hope you guys have enjoyed this series as much as I have. As tends to happen with me when I start learning more about a subject, I've been going down the rabbit hole, so I was laying in bed last night watching From the Earth to the Moon on the HBO Max app. So I'm on to part 4 already on that, so I haven't gotten nearly as far as we are on this series, but it's still been fun to go back and watch that. And for those of you who have asked, I have seen the movie First Man, and I really enjoyed it like a lot of you did, so thank you for that. And just keep those recommendations coming. There's been a lot of just really fantastic comments on this series. It hasn't done as well in terms of viewership compared to a lot of our other series, but that's okay. Those of you who have been watching seem to be really enjoying it. So as always, the link's in the description to the original content and to the beginning of this series if you haven't seen the first 2 episodes. We are on to part 3, and it's Houston, we've had a problem.
On the 20th of July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. But now that President Kennedy's goal had been accomplished, interest in space exploration began to fade. NASA's budget was slashed. There would only be resources for 6 more lunar flights.
And that, we talked yesterday a little bit about the negatives, the drawbacks to setting an ambitious goal like that, and how it's a really good thing. There are a lot of positives from it, but there's also some negatives. And another negative is that when you have put all of your resources toward a particular goal, it means that once you've hit that goal, now it's like, and you just kind of, you don't have the energy and the resources to continue to other goals. It's a weird analogy, I know, but when you're getting married and you plan a wedding and you spend a couple of years putting all your energy and your time into planning every detail of the wedding, you get to the wedding and by the time it's over, you're exhausted, but now you have a marriage and you have a honeymoon and you have all this other stuff. And so that's the case here. There's a lot more for NASA to do, but the moon was the goal. The moon was the thing that everything that has happened so far was geared toward. So now what?
But in its final chapter, the Apollo program would make its greatest scientific discoveries and face the deadliest perils of spaceflight.
I'm not sure you can get hit by lightning. We got more than a problem.
Houston, say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Apollo 11 landed safely, but it completely missed its intended landing site. NASA's plans for lunar exploration relied on its ability to land astronauts at precise points of scientific interest. It would be up to Apollo 12 to attempt a pinpoint landing. Apollo 12 would aim to land next to the Surveyor 3 probe, which had been on the moon since 1967. If NASA could hit this precise target, they'd prove that a pinpoint landing was possible.
And, again, we're talking about this stuff, 50 years later, like, no big deal, right? But I mean, you got to remember everything's moving in space, right? So the Earth is moving and the moon is moving and it's all rotating and it's all going around the sun and so you're hitting a moving target with something that's also moving really, really fast. When we see stuff floating around in space, it doesn't look like it's moving, but it's moving really, really fast.
Apollo 12's crew was Mission Commander Pete Conrad, Command Module Pilot Dick Gordon, and Lunar Module Pilot Alan Bean. They were a tight-knit crew who drove matching gold Corvettes to work at Kennedy Space Center.
That's awesome.
Conrad and Gordon had already flown together on Gemini 11.
Which somebody mentioned yesterday, and I do believe it is true. I think NASA called it Gemini rather than Gemini.
All 3 men had been stationed at the United States Naval Test Pilot School at Patuxent River, Maryland. But their mission almost didn't make it into orbit.
6.
As the countdown reached 0, huge thunderclouds loomed overhead.
0. All engines running. Commit. Liftoff.
The colossal Saturn V rocket and its exhaust trail were acting as a gigantic lightning rod.
Can't believe they launched in a thunderstorm. That's crazy.
2 lightning strikes shut down the service module's fuel cells and knocked out the command module's guidance system.
What?
But nobody had seen the strikes. All they could see was a barrage of errors and warnings.
I got 3 fuel cell lights, an AC bus light, a fuel cell disconnect, AC bus overload, 1 and 2, main bus A and B out.
Now, put yourself in their position for a second. Yes, I know that these astronauts, they have a very particular personality type and a very particular mindset that's mission-oriented and focused. So they're not like the average Joe, right? But I feel like the average Joe would be freaking the heck out if you're on a rocket with millions of pounds of thrust heading toward the moon and you get struck by lightning, and not whether they knew it or not, and you've got all these lights flashing and going and out, you know, and you're on this thing that's shooting into space. I would be losing my mind.
In Mission Control, Flight Director Jerry Griffin was moments from calling an abort. But a young flight controller named John Aaron was able to interpret the chaotic data and come up with a solution.
This is another great point. You know, we're singing the praises of the astronauts, and rightfully so, but man, there's a lot of really, really just elite people on these missions. And these people that we have never heard of who are crucial to making these things a success and to making decisions that are going to make or break these missions.
With no time to explain, he relayed an obscure instruction to the crew.
Apollo 12 Houston, try FCE to auxiliary, over. NCE to auxiliary. FCE to auxiliary.
The command was so obscure that neither the flight director or Conrad had any idea what it meant. But in the lunar module pilot's seat, Alan Bean understood Aaron's solution. He switched to a set of backup electronics that had escaped the lightning strike.
Jeez.
And the mission was back on track.
Wow.
I'm not sure you can get hit by lightning.
The problem had been diagnosed and fixed within moments. It was a testament to the rigorous training of the astronauts and mission control staff.
Yeah, I mean, because these guys, it's not like they just got in this thing and went, right? We know from the training, I mean, training like Apollo 1 where they died. I mean, they're going through this stuff and they're probably troubleshooting all the different things that can go wrong so that when it happens, you're prepared. You've got kind of muscle memory, right? You know exactly where the switches are. You know what code, you know, when he says SCE to auxiliary, you're not looking for a half hour trying to find where that is. One of you is going to have some idea of where that is.
The crew of Apollo 12 continued their journey to the moon and made a safe landing.
Was it PINPOINT?
When Pete Conrad set foot on the lunar surface, his first words lacked Neil Armstrong's gravitas, but he more than made up for it with his delight.
Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me.
That's awesome.
Step off the pad. Ooh, is that frosting?
As he looked around the landing site,
There
he
it is.
saw that their mission had been accomplished.
That's what I see sitting on the side of the crater.
Nice.
Little surveyor, little surveyor, yes sir.
That's cool. 600 feet. That is, I don't think we can overstate how epic that is that they landed that close to that.
How about that?
Huh, that's cool.
Apollo 12 had made its pinpoint landing next to the Surveyor 3 probe. It was located in Oceanus Procellarum, also known as the Ocean of Storms.
Yeah, appropriate. Apollo 13.
Now, NASA had sent astronauts to the moon 4 times, including 2 successful landings. But if lunar flight was starting to look routine, the next Apollo mission would be a terrifying reminder of the dangers of spaceflight.
Heck yeah. That's fair. The successful failure, yeah. You came home alive, that's a success.
The third lunar landing attempt marked a shift in the Apollo program. Previous missions had largely been test flights of the spacecraft. Apollo 13 would focus on scientific discovery. It would land at the Fra Mauro Highlands, whose ancient terrain could provide insight into the origins of the solar system. Adapting a motto from the US Naval Academy, the mission patch features the words Ex Luna Scientia, from the moon, knowledge. But before the crew of Apollo 13 reached the moon, a disaster would leave them fighting for their lives. The mission commander was veteran astronaut Jim Lovell, who had travelled further and spent more time in space than any other astronaut.
He had been on, there was Apollo 8, the one that took that famous picture and read from Genesis and did that first orbit of the moon.
Between his Gemini 7 flight with Frank Borman, his Gemini 12 flight with Buzz Aldrin, and his trip around the moon on Apollo 8, he'd spent 572 hours in space and travelled almost 7 million miles.
Jeez.
He was joined by two rookie astronauts, Lunar Module pilot Fred Hayes and Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly.
That makes this even more impressive when you realize that two of these three guys had never been in space before.
But just 2 days before launch, Ken Mattingly was grounded after being exposed to German measles and replaced by another astronaut, Jack Swigert.
2 days.
Swigert was considered an excellent pilot, but the last-minute change was a difficult blow for a crew that had trained so intensely together.
You're comfortable with each other. You're used to how things operate. When you get comfortable with people, especially people you're going to be in close confined space with for for a couple of weeks, that's a big change.
This is the crew of Apollo 13. Wish everybody there a nice evening, and we're just about ready to close out our inspection of Aquarius and get back for a pleasant evening at Odyssey.
The Apollo 13 crew had just completed a live TV broadcast on their way to the moon. But it went no further than mission control. With public interest in the Apollo program fading, no US TV network would carry their show.
That's incredible. I mean, think about what an amazing thing this is and how quickly America's like, all right, cool, we're on the moon, no big deal. We lose our sense of wonder over something that is a huge, huge deal.
As the astronauts packed away their camera equipment, there were a few housekeeping procedures to take care of.
13, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like you to stir up your cryo.
That's what did it.
The command and service module was powered by 3 fuel cells that generated electricity by mixing hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen was stored as a very cold liquid in 2 storage tanks. In zero gravity, the temperature and density of the oxygen could become uneven in different areas of the tank, which made it difficult to measure how much was left. The solution was to stir the liquid oxygen with a fan.
I keep saying this, but it's just, I'm so blown away by all of the things they had to think about, right? It's not just a matter of coming up with a way to generate electricity. You have to come up with a way to make sure that you keep it even in the tank. And all of the little things, all the details that had to have been thought of to get them to this point. That's why it's so amazing to me that they got on the moon in the first place, because there were a million decisions like this that had to be made to get them that far.
During a ground test just a few weeks earlier, a heater inside oxygen tank number 2 was accidentally left on, and its interior was baked to over 500 degrees Celsius.
Jeez.
This damaged the Teflon insulation around the wires leading to the fan. When Jack Swagger turned that fan on, electrical current arced across the wires, starting a fire.
Wow, I had no idea that's what it was.
The pressure of expanding gas turned the oxygen tank into a bomb.
Okay, we still do one overhead. We got more than a problem. Okay, one.
Houston, say again, please.
Pressure. I don't know what it is.
Houston, we've had a problem.
As the staff at Mission Control frantically tried to understand what...
And even how calm that was said, right? You just had a freaking explosion on your spacecraft in space on your way to the moon. And you're like, yeah, we've had a problem. Like, just cool, calm, collected. Love it.
had happened to the spacecraft. Lovell glanced out of the side window of the command module.
It looks to me that we are offending something. It's a gas of some sort.
Their second oxygen tank had also been damaged in the blast and was bleeding its contents into space. Soon, there would be nothing left for the astronauts to breathe, let alone to generate electricity.
Wow.
There was one chance for survival. Apollo 13's lunar module, Aquarius, had oxygen, fuel, and a descent engine that could be used to put them on a course back to Earth.
And here's the thing, you can't just stop in mid-space and turn around and go back, right? You have to keep going, swing around the moon, and come back.
The crew shut down the command module to preserve its tiny reserve of battery power for re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. And all three of them climbed into the two-person lunar module. Conditions were cramped and bitterly cold. NASA staff worked around the clock to solve countless engineering and navigation problems that put the astronauts' lives in constant danger.
This is heroic stuff by all of these people, not just the guys in space. What these brilliant minds on the ground did is amazing too.
One of the most serious problems they faced was stopping the astronauts from being poisoned by their own exhaled carbon dioxide. The lunar module used round canisters of lithium hydroxide to filter carbon dioxide from the air. But there were only enough of these canisters to support 2 astronauts for 2 days. The command module used a similar system, but those canisters were square-shaped. Fortunately, to provide an emergency backup, NASA had developed a procedure during preparation for Apollo 8 to build an air purifier using a lithium hydroxide canister and items found in the spacecraft.
Thinking of everything.
The makeshift device was made of cardboard, tape, and an astronaut's sock.
Wow.
But it worked perfectly.
Dang.
And removed the poisonous carbon dioxide from the cabin's atmosphere.
Amazing.
Having survived the flight back to Earth, the crew faced re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. They climbed back into the command module and jettisoned Aquarius, which wouldn't survive re-entry.
We got the events plan. Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you.
We thank
The
you.
command module had been powered down and left in freezing conditions for days. Its heat shield might have been cracked when the oxygen tank exploded, or its parachutes might have frozen solid.
And listen, I mean, let's not underestimate how dangerous re-entry is. There were at least, I think, 2 Soviet missions that the astronauts or the cosmonauts died on re-entry. I think there was one with one guy, and like it was horrifying. Like they have recordings of him like cursing the people who put him in that situation as he knew that he was going to die. And I think there was another one where 3 guys died.
The astronauts were expected to be out of contact with Houston for 4 minutes during re-entry.
And of course, years later you have Columbia, which breaks up on re-entry.
But 4 minutes passed. And then 5. With no word from the crew.
Wow.
But after 6 agonizing minutes, Odyssey reappeared.
Epic.
The astronauts had survived. Apollo 13 failed to land on the moon, but against all the odds and through incredible determination and ingenuity, NASA brought Lovell, Hayes and Swaggart home safely. The mission became known as the successful failure.
That's the kind you want if you're going to have a failure.
Apollo 14 would see the unlikely return of one of America's original space heroes, Alan Shepard. Launching aboard a tiny one-person capsule, Shepard became the first American in space in May 1961.
Oxygen, go! All systems are go!
He was due to command the first mission of Project Gemini, but he began experiencing bouts of extreme dizziness and nausea. He was diagnosed with Meniere's disease, a disorder of the inner ear. There was no known cure, and it seemed he would never be assigned to another spaceflight. Shepard was appointed Chief of the Astronaut Office, overseeing crew training and mission planning. Outside of NASA, he also made a small fortune investing in real estate, banking, and oil drilling.
You know, it's actually a really cool thing to kind of learn about what a lot of these guys have done in their post-NASA lives. Like Neil Armstrong became a professor at the University of Cincinnati. Imagine, you know, and that was like within a couple of years of landing on the moon. So imagine going to university in the 1970s and you have Neil Armstrong as your professor. That's just really, really cool. John Glenn, of course, becomes a senator from Ohio for many years, decades.
But he was determined to fly in space again. In the summer of 1968, he underwent an experimental and risky surgical procedure to correct his disorder. Now, Shepard would return as the commander of Apollo 14.
Cool, good for him.
But Shepard's struggles continued. The mission was almost overcome by glitches on the way to the moon. After launch, the docking mechanism between the command module and lunar module wouldn't engage.
Goes to show you how smoothly Apollo 11 and 12 went, comparatively speaking, when you see the issues that 13 and 14 had.
Before lunar descent, the computer tried to abort the
Although
landing.
I should say, really, 11 was the smoothest one of all of them, because 12 had the lightning issues.
And had to be reprogrammed mid-flight. Finally, the landing radar stopped working just as the crew were approaching the surface. But Shepard had come too far to be stopped by glitches. With the support of Mission Control, he and his crew overcame these problems and made a perfect landing. The closest yet to their target.
Even without radar.
Over the course of 2 moonwalks, Shepard and his lunar module pilot Ed Mitchell ventured further from their lunar module than any previous astronauts. They climbed steep terrain, investigated ancient craters, and gathered more rock and soil samples than Apollo 11 or 12. With his mission objectives completed, Shepard brought out a golf ball that he'd smuggled in the pockets of his spacesuit.
I knew somebody hit a golf ball on the moon, but I didn't know who it was. I didn't realize it was Alan Shepard.
Using his sampling tool as a club, he teed off next to the lunar module.
That's awesome. The upgrade.
The final 3 missions would be the most scientifically productive, and they were equipped with advanced hardware.
Think about, so just as kind of an aside to all of this, as many of you have mentioned, yeah, we've got these Artemis missions that are planned, right? We've already had one of them, I think. So in the next couple of years, I believe the plan is they're going to put a woman and a person of color on the moon for the first time. And I know some people are going to say, well, what's with the wokeness of that? But listen, you want to generate interest, right? You want something new. And so I've got no problem with that, really. I don't. And especially if they're qualified. But we're also going to have like 4K video, right, of the moon. So this is going to be so different than it was then.
Their upgraded lunar module had enough supplies to support astronauts for 3 days. New spacesuits and backpacks enabled moonwalks as long as 7 hours. And the new lunar rover allowed astronauts to explore much larger areas of the moon's surface. Meanwhile, the command module pilot conducted extensive surveys of the moon from orbit, using a new suite of cameras and scientific instruments. Dave Scott, on his third spaceflight, would be the commander of Apollo 15.
Another West Point grad in MIT.
The crew made one of the biggest geological discoveries of the program when they unearthed a chunk of anorthosite, a piece of the moon's primordial crust, 4.5 billion years old. Apollo 16 was commanded by John Young, who had already flown to the moon on Apollo 10. The lunar module pilot was Charlie Duke, and the command module pilot would be Ken Mattingly, who had lost his place on Apollo 13 just days before the launch, and was finally getting his chance to fly in space. Young and Duke spent 3 days on the lunar surface, traveling great distances with the aid of the lunar rover.
One to go.
But now, budget cutbacks had brought the Apollo program to an early end. Apollo 17 would be its final flight.
Gene Cernan.
On December the 7th, 1972, Apollo 17 prepared to depart. It was the only night launch of a Saturn V. The rocket's blazing exhaust plume lit up the sky at Cape Kennedy. The final mission was commanded by Gene Cernan. His command module pilot was Ron Evans, and the lunar module pilot was Harrison Schmitt.
Doctorate from Harvard.
On this final mission, Schmitt represented a first. A professional geologist, he was the only scientist astronaut to walk on the moon.
So the only one who wasn't a military background, which is pretty much standard now. I mean, you're gonna have pilots with military backgrounds, but you're putting a lot of scientists in space now.
Apollo 17 landed at Taurus Littrow, the most geologically complex site yet visited. Cernan and Schmitt spent a total of 22 hours walking on the moon. They traveled 19 miles across its surface, and they collected more scientific data than any other mission. But after 3 days on the moon, it was time to leave. Cernan and Schmitt would be the last humans to walk on the moon in the 20th century.
Hasn't happened for 50
years. But as the Apollo program came to an end, NASA was preparing for new adventures in spaceflight. The first US space station, Skylab, would launch in 1973, aboard an Apollo Saturn V rocket. In 1975, the United States and the Soviet Union flew a joint mission, the Apollo-Soyuz test project.
Big deal. Really cool.
It was the final flight of an Apollo spacecraft, and the symbolic end of the space race. 1981 would see the first flight of the Space Shuttle.
And I believe that the space shuttle had already been designed and planned by the time the Apollo missions were coming to an end. Just took a while to implement it.
The mission was commanded by Apollo astronaut John Young, and it ushered in the next era of spaceflight. But for the Apollo program, 1972 was the end of the road. As Cernan climbed into the lunar module at the end of the mission, he bade farewell to the moon and shared his hope that humans would soon return.
And as we leave the moon in Taurus Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return.
God willing.
With peace and in hope for all mankind.
That was cool. A few more years. Awesome. Oh, I can't wait. Can't wait. Can't wait to see us walk on the moon again. Cannot wait to see us land on Mars. And who knows what happens after that. So I'm excited. I hope you guys have enjoyed that as much as I have. Like I said, just something different. I enjoyed it, and I will definitely get into more things like this because there's a lot more to explore about this part of history and the space race. We can even look at some of the Soviet stuff. And so if you have suggestions, ideas, use the comment section below. I read every comment, even if I don't reply, even if I don't respond to it. I did read it, so I welcome your recommendations. Thanks for watching.